exactitude, particularly because, even determining all the vital factors of each instance becomes such an intensive job itself, making the necessary determination of the relative value of all things ever more elusive and costly. Ballistics, for instance, is a relatively exacting science, but it is not perfectly exact. We can determine the relatively exact minimum velocity of a throw a third baseman might have to make to first base. But is it necessary or conducive for the third baseman to make that determination in the midst of the play? No. Instead, by experience and training, they recognize when they must hurry a throw, and thus how much routine carefulness they must forfeit to try to make the out. There are for us likewise rules or principles we should follow. I dismiss the idea that we should account for supply and demand, because on the contrary, the idea of supply and demand is merely a tool of exploitation. It does not determine the value of production. Instead, it determines the stress it can impose on a market deprived of the opportunity to decide the value of the work of production. The concept of supply and demand determining value, therefore, is a destruction of the concept of determining the value of production. That destruction can and will usurp earnings from the deserving, while multiplying unfair prices to whatever degree the market can stand. Supply and demand, therefore, is utter corruption, both of the idea of determining real value and of appropriate distribution of wealth, or just reward for production. Your question is pertinent, and it is a goal we should have, at least in some cases which I mention subsequently. But in my estimation, at least three things will go awry in the best efforts we can reasonably make to determine exact value. 1. No way will we truly account for all things exactly. 2. Nor will the other guy with whom we're trading. 3. And finally then, neither will we have any real basis to determine equality in the other's work. All we can do then is the best we can with reasonable dedication to determination of approximate value. Largely, in fact, we are best assisted in this effort by the integrity of the society. Only in a society where no one is seeking unearned profit, and where instead everyone is conscientious about the relative value of their own work, can we trust in the price they may ask of their work. Integrity, therefore, is the most valuable and expedient tool for determining value as exactly as is practical. For ages, except as compelled by usury to seek unearned gain ourselves, we've settled for integrity determining value because it gives us the opportunity to forego repeating all that determination ourselves without access to the many vital facts which would determine value. Where there is integrity, instead we can trust that suspicion will be raised by some clue that the principle of integrity is violated. Then we, the buyer, can roughly determine approximate value, in fact actually appraising the integrity of the price asked. The more unearned gain usury demands of us, on the contrary, the more the subjects of usury themselves are driven to corruption, and the more we can trust instead that price involves maximal possible unearned gain. An obvious penalty of usury, therefore, is destruction of integrity, because integrity is least likely to survive the penalties of usury. In mathematically perfected economy, therefore, the only penalty we suffer is whatever errors we make in trying to determine equivalence. In the end, just as in dividing the task of weeding your yard, as the extra effort we may make in trying to determine exact value may very well exceed the small difference we are trying to determine exactly, we do better in terms of the time we give up by taking the loss of our rough estimation. Let your kids pick or draw the lots, or determine them among themselves. So we resolve the issue more effectively by settling for what we cannot determine exactly, but can determine roughly or to sufficient satisfaction by simple means. We know, for instance, that carpenters and plumbers and electricians and drywallers and roofers and so forth are involved in building the home we want to buy. None of these are equivalent to our own trade. Neither, if they were, is our work worth exactly what these practitioners is. But perhaps we are that second welder, and although the many contractors who gladly employ us keep us working all we need, no, they don't pay us but a pittance of what we're worth to them, but by giving us a few overtime hours here or there. We accept that or we don't. But if we do, we're not going to get equal production for our production, are we? Absolutely not. But because we are paid at least somewhat better for our demanding class of work, at least we can buy our house for substantially less time than the workers who produced it put into it. And we don't have to pay the bankers 3 houses to get our one, for no more than publishing our promises to pay. If you or anyone else in history has a better idea, I'm all ears. But it isn't to make time the unit of currency. It is not the job of an economic system, therefore, to impose a method of determining value. Nor are markets free to determine value if they are subject to usury or market manipulation by cost and demand through vehicles such as commodities trading. The only truly free market, therefore, is mathematically perfected economy, because only mathematically perfected economy eliminates all the redundant, unearned factors which exploit price to the detriment of the producer and ultimate market. It is hogwash, for instance, that Austrian economists, who in fact advocate interest, assert that if we leave determination of price to markets, which are subject to interest, or buyers of futures, the market resolves value. On the contrary, unnecessary cost is imposed by exploitation. Only a market free of predation and subject only to the real costs of production is free first to determine the value of production, and secondly to distribute wealth justly, to acquire just reward for its endeavors. Thus I do believe we should leave it to truly free markets to determine value, and I'll tell you why. First of all, that's what the market wants to do. It wants to be free of predation, and it wants to be free to determine value. So why not let it? Secondly, what's going to happen with our second welder? Given the minimal costs of mathematically perfected economy, with the opportunity to readily afford going into business for himself. He can tell each contractor he works for that he will settle for a wage, say 8 times the going rate for his fellow welders, taking 80% of his demonstrated value to make the working situation quite comfortable to his employer. Or to base his wage on production, making it even more conducive to the sanctity of his employers. He can divide a day's wages by the usual 2 effective welds per day and offer to take something like 80% of that per weld. In either case, the contractor is making an extra 20% profit over usual wages, and our second welder can at least make 80% of what he's worth in terms of volume of production. On the other hand, if the contractors refuse to give him that, he can buy a welding truck for a pittance under mathematically perfected economy and compete with the contractors by underbidding their welding costs by 20%. And they can't touch him while he makes a due comparative fortune for the efforts which make him excel at his craft. A truly free market can indeed determine just value. But where contracts can be purchased by corruption, or the dollar is subject to interest, or futures traders might fix the value of his work without any consideration whatever for its costs or real value, or denying him the opportunity to acquire the value of his work, just value and reward are only made impossible. We have made do in terms of determining the relative value of our money, even as that money can only multiply debt into terminal debt, and even as that money is constantly devalued by the process which does so. The most real possible value of money, which is strictly a token of wealth, however, is still merely relative and approximate. The best we can do so that the approximate value of money we have decided to our relative satisfaction is enduring, however, is to eliminate multiplication of debt in proportion to the money, and to maintain a circulation which at all times is as equivalent as we can rightly determine with the remaining value of the property which, across time, we intend for it to represent. This is why these are goals of mathematically perfected economy, which of course have long been recognized goals of real producers, even if they have been made impossible by ages of usury. Thus shall we continue paying bankers 3 houses for printing our promises to pay on their paper until the sum of debt was terminal yesterday? Or shall we cut our losses to the small inconsistencies we have so far found agreeable in determining approximately equivalent value, especially as there may not even be any overall benefit in the potentially impractical task of determining value exactly? It is for us, then, to rectify all these things, as our worldwide mandate for mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation is engineered to reconstitute rectitude out of the present injustice. What did Jefferson tell us? He said, "Leave no authority existing not responsible to the people." He told us what the sole purpose of government is. It is to secure our rights that we resort to government at all. He foretold the consequences of being taxed in our meat and in our drink. If we run into such debts is that we must be taxed in our meat and in our drink, in our necessaries and our comforts, in our